Welcome to the Great Lakes Fishing Podcast. Today we have a little bit of a different type of show. We're bringing in one gentleman from the Great Lakes Fishery Commission and a filmmaker. If you've been watching your Prime stuff, you'll see it. There's a new documentary out on Prime. It's been out. I know Lindsey has been working out on the tours out there, seeing lots of different film festivals, but it is called The Fish Thief, a Great Lakes Mystery. Welcome to the show, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Lindsey, let's start with you. How'd you get the idea to start to put this documentary together?
Well, I made a public television film about the Great Lakes, a 2-hour public television film that started airing in 2010. It was on the air for 3 years. And this story was a small part of that. That first film traced the history of the relationship between people and the Great Lakes ecosystem. The first half of it looked at how people came into the region, used Great Lakes natural resources to create economies culminating in the great industrial heartland that won World War II and all those kinds of things, created the auto industry, the steel industry in North America. And the second half looked at how all of that development and that use of Great Lakes natural resources impacted the Great Lakes ecosystem and the Great Lakes themselves. And so, and then how people have been looking to put the Great Lakes back to being someplace resembling what it was naturally, where we can fish and hunt and boat and do those kinds of things. So the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, and Marc in particular here, was very helpful to me in putting together a part of that story about the first milestone invasive species invasion into the Great Lakes. And when my film was done, Marc came to me and said, "Hey, we really liked what you did about with your first film here. Would you consider telling our story and making another documentary about this story?" So I was honored and flattered, and I jumped at the opportunity. So it's been wonderful to work with Marc and with the Great Lakes Fishery Commission staff. They've been extremely helpful and supportive, and I hope people will enjoy the final product that's come out of this effort.
Yeah, the Great Lakes are 1/5 of the Earth's surface freshwater. It is a huge piece of water, a huge piece of what we do here on Earth. But it's always been changing. Certainly a lot of changes in the last 200 years. And I was talking with Lindsey before you came on, Marc, that, it's just evolving all the time. Can you tell us a little bit? We'll go to Marc here. Give us an overview of kind of some of the changes that the Great Lakes has seen over the last couple hundred years.
Well, European settlement of the Great Lakes region certainly changed a lot in terms of farming and land use and logging and fisheries. And fisheries is a big part of that too. And the film talks about the commercial fishing industry in particular, starting about the 1880s, 1890s, when some of the big changes began to happen. And the genesis of this film was really to capture the changes in the Great Lakes, in particular caused by invasive species, and the granddaddy of them all, the sea lamprey, which invaded the Great Lakes. So changes happen for a number of reasons: human changes on the land, habitat loss, commercial fishing, recreational fishing, and invasive species. This is all about the fish thief, and spoiler alert, it's the sea lamprey is the fish thief. But really, it's also the story of the remarkable effort that people did starting about the 1930s, 1940s to try and respond to this really existential threat to the Great Lakes fishery. We wanted to tell that it's a sad story of loss and really what the Great Lakes and the people of the region lost because of this invasive species. But it's also an exhilarating story of human achievement, of responding to it and finding a way to deal with this really monumental problem that's led to ruin of the fishery. And then since the 1950s, the miraculous recovery of the fishery, such that it's about a $5.1 billion resource. And that's the story that we told.
Yeah, we think, at least the people that generally watch our show, think of the Great Lakes as a sport fishery, but obviously still a commercial fishery going on there. But 100 years ago and 150 years ago, that's the fishery that was there. This was a commercial fishery. This is where people made their living out there. And when these things happened, it literally, the economies of some of these cities collapse when these types of things happen. Can you tell the story a little bit, Lindsey, on that, on the human side of it, and how some of these people were affected as the sea lamprey invasion came in, and people literally, basically lost their job because of it?
Yes, the invasion was, first of all, a mystery. Nobody understood what was going on. There had been other fishery crashes preceding this. In Lake Ontario, there was a strong Atlantic salmon fishery that went bust in the late 1800s. And then there was a very large lake herring fishery in Lake Erie that went bust in the early 20th century. And those were largely attributed to overfishing and then habitat destruction. In both Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, there was a lot of damming of tributary streams where Atlantic salmon, especially in Lake Ontario, went to spawn. And then in Lake Erie, there was that was kind of the center of the Great Lakes industrial development. So a lot of corporations, a lot of steel mills, a lot of factories there, chemical plants dumped their waste into Lake Erie, and so pollution and overfishing became, that's what was understood to be behind those earlier fish crashes. But when it came to fish crashes starting to happen in Lakes Ontario and Lake Michigan, nobody understood what was going on, but it was affecting people's lives in small towns on lake shores and on tributary rivers in Canada and the United States. All of a sudden, small businesses were going under. The catches of commercial fishermen at the time were basically starting to disappear. And so people would come to their politicians and to their congresspeople and their parliamentarians in Canada and say, hey, you guys got to help us here. We can't figure out what's going on here. The big fishing companies at the time, commercial fishing was a very large industry, much larger than it is right now at the time. And people went, those people had a lot of political pull, and they went to their government official and said, hey, we need help here. But they resisted any kind of regulation, or, they didn't want to have their catches limited or anything like that. So this push-pull came between the commercial industries and the governments trying to figure out what was going on, and then the industries that wanted to just keep fishing. And so the government officials they established some scientific labs that started looking into this. And, this is the story of some remarkable people who fought against the odds. It's a story of persistence and tenacity of how these people just kept looking at things. The first things that they tried didn't work. The other things that they tried didn't work, but they just kept going and going and going, looking for a needle in a haystack. And eventually they find something that looks promising. So that's the essence of the story.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that I found from watching it was that, these sea lamprey came obviously from the ocean all the way through the system, but they were discovered in Lake Erie in the 20s, but the real explosion didn't happen until they made their way into Lake Huron. Can you guys talk a little bit about why Lake Huron was the epicenter of this and not the lakes that came before it as the lamprey invasion made its way through the Great Lakes?
Yeah, I'll speak a little to that. The lamprey invaded the Finger Lakes of New York and Lake Ontario in the mid 1800s. And they had a negative effect on those lakes. It was written in the literature. So actually, the scientists who were watching the lamprey kind of spread westward kind of knew that it could be very destructive if it were unleashed. In Lake Erie, it was discovered first in 1921 after there was basically a complete rebuild of the Welland Canal, which bypasses Niagara Falls. And Lake Erie kind of slowed it down because there's not a lot of good lamprey habitat for spawning in Lake Erie. It's shallowest of the lakes, it's warmest, and lampreys need a certain type of stream for spawning where it's rocky upstream and kind of silty downstream. They build nests in rocks, and then the larvae burrow into the mud and live for several years before they metamorphose into that adult that kills fish in the open lake. And Lake Erie just had a limited number of those streams. But everything above Lake Erie, even Lake St. Clair, but certainly Lakes Huron, Michigan, and Superior, abundant in those kinds of spawning streams, and also Lake Ontario. So that's why really once the lamprey made it into Lake Huron, It was kind of an open sushi bar because lots of fish for the lamprey to eat and pretty much unlimited spawning habitat. And you know what? The scientists knew by that point. The word was out. It was all hands on deck. Report any lamprey that you see. And the commercial fishing industry knew it by that point too. And Lindsey captured some compelling stories in this film. We tried our best to talk to people who remember this firsthand. They would have been very young. But there were plenty that we talked to, maybe came from commercial fishing families that were multi-generational. And there's stories in there where, recounting the first encounters with the lamprey in, say, the far western part of Lake Superior. And they knew what it meant because of the destruction that the species had inflicted on the system as they made their way throughout the system.
Yeah, we definitely see the fishery now as a Pacific salmon fishery, but at that time, lake trout were king. And you guys had a scene in the film. Someone was appearing before Congress, and they testified that about 80% of the lake trout they caught had some sort of lamprey scar on them, and that's not counting obviously the ones that were deceased. So a really, really big situation that was difficult to solve. Let's talk a little bit about, well, actually, I want to talk to you, Lindsey. Mark brought up something I wanted to talk about, which is I'm interested in how you track these people down. You had a lot of interviews in there and a lot of different voices in there. As a filmmaker, what are the challenges to finding the people that you need to tell the story you want to tell?
Well, this documentary was actually an offshoot and a part of an oral history project that Mark initiated at the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. So it's one product that came out of an effort that the Fishery Commission started. And as part of that, they hired a postgrad, a guy named Corey Brandt, who appears in the film. And he was the spearhead. He was the point man to go out and try to find everything that we could potentially consider using to build the story. And so Corey did the yeoman's work of going out and locating as many people as he could that were first generation, that were the original participants in this story, what people at the Great Lakes Fishery Commission affectionately call the original lamprey chokers. And so he went around and found all these people. He just traveled around with a small video camera and did preliminary video interviews. And all of those interviews that he shot are going to be part of an archive, an oral history archive at the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. Then, based on who he was able to find, and we determined, if they could make a good contribution to the film, we went back and filmed those people with the kind of equipment that we use to make these kinds of films. So I can't give Corey enough credit. He did a lot of the real serious digging there, and then he and I worked very closely together, and we traveled together to go around and shoot the interviews with these people and get their stories firsthand. And then he and I also worked closely on getting the archival images and the archival footage, all the kinds of things that went into making this film that make it the unique project that it is.
Very good. Mark, tell me a little bit about, we've kind of got into this discovery area, but now that we're getting into, the 1940s, where it's pretty obvious that we've got a huge issue on our hands. What was it like on the ground at that point, not just for the anglers and for the commercial fishermen, but for the scientists that know this is happening and just kind of trying to figure out what a solution could possibly be?
Yeah, it was awful and it was scary. People were watching their livelihoods evaporate in front of their eyes. And the scientists were out there trying to understand what was happening. They didn't even know the life cycle of the lamprey early on. So you had to know your enemy first, and that is, where do they spawn? When do they spawn? And how long do they live in the stream bottoms? It's really easy to make this point in the film to kill fish, but it's very difficult to kill just what you're after. And there were no solutions to this. Certainly as the invasion was unfolding, if you wanted to get rid of the sea lamprey, you basically had to kill everything in a stream. And that would be a cure worse than the disease. So it was really helpless, a feeling of helplessness. But it wasn't a feeling that all hope was lost. There was this was an era of science, certainly to use scientific discovery to your advantage. and they set out to do what really a lot of folks thought was impossible, and that is find something that would kill the lamprey and leave the rest of the fishery and the ecosystem intact. We don't have really many examples, even to this day on the planet, where you can selectively target a species, and certainly at the geographic scale that we have in the Great Lakes Basin. So it's an extraordinary discovery that they made. It wasn't luck. It certainly is fortunate that something exists that will kill lamprey and not harm fish. But they tested thousands and thousands and thousands of things, chemicals, to try and find something that would be selective to lamprey, and they found it. Lindsey called it a needle in a haystack, and it's probably a great metaphor for this, because it was just miraculous what they did. And the scientists were leading the charge, encouraging all the way, never giving up. That's what the story is about. These discoveries that were made decades and decades ago are paying off today, and continue to.
Yeah, one of the things I always like to tell my kids is that Formula 409, it has that number because it was the 409th formula that they tried before they got what worked. And what I found out from watching the film, that this was Formula 5,209. So luck is hard work plus opportunity, and obviously 5,209 different things to try. That's hard work. Tell us a little bit about. Go ahead, Lindsey.
No, I was going to say, but chemistry wasn't the first thing that they tried. The film kind of points out that Vernon Applegate, the gentleman, the scientist who was the point man on this thing, had other ideas. He came up with 3 strategies, and two in advance of what ended up working. He tried very diligently using different technologies to block sea lamprey from getting into spawning streams, and from getting them to prevent them from leaving spawning streams to go out into the lakes. He thought those were going to be the things that were going to work first, and so those didn't end up working out. But he didn't give up, and they had to keep fighting, and he had the support of the heads of laboratories and everything, who kept doing battle with Congress to keep the funding going. This is really a story of human tenacity. I've talked to community college students about this and said, this isn't a story just for people who like fishing or who care about the Great Lakes. This is for anybody who is going to face challenges in their life. And when the first thing that they tried doesn't work out, these people worked on this for years and years and years, and kept coming up with new angles of trying something new. And as you said, it took testing 5,209 chemicals to finally find the one. And so, this is a story of human persistence and just never giving up, and human creativity, coming up with new ways to tackle problems. So
I'd like to add too, I had this vision where when they got to that chemical and discovered that it worked, that they were running around, Eureka, we got it, and popping champagne corks and all that. And doing historical research, you sometimes have quite a different conception of what it was in your mind versus the reality. And I think these people were very modest and humble as well, because they were they didn't know if it was going to work. And so they kept trying things. So the lampricide, for example, there's a little slip of paper for each chemical that they tested. And it was just, what was the results? How much did you put in? What happened after 12 hours? What was the temperature, and so on? And then it says at the, result at the bottom, and usually it's a bunch of numbers. And the one for TFM, that was the one that proved to be successful, all that was written at the bottom was special. And then on that slip, and then there's a thing, how was it reported? And usually it's, I put a memo to file that it didn't work and we move on. This one said reported verbally. So when Lindsey interviewed the individual who actually made that discovery, Cliff Cortman, who is in the film, we asked the question, did you run upstairs and how did you report it verbally? Did you say, we got it? And it was more of like, no, it was just, we knew this was a little different, but you don't want to get your hopes up. You want to see how it works in the field, because these are scientists. So just because it works in the lab, is it going to work in the field? And so on. And our story was full of that, where we thought, is this going to be the announcement? And it was more like, we think this is working, but we need to see. And that's kind of how it turned out.
And beyond that as well, they didn't stop there. They kept looking. They were preparing that maybe something's going to go wrong with this, or maybe we can find something even better that'll be more economical, that'll be more effective, that will be more select, more safe in some way or something. They were preparing. They had been through so many disappointments that they just decided, we can't put all our eggs in this basket. Let's just keep going. And the Fishery Commission still is looking for options of other ways to deal with sea lamprey. Even though TFM remains the main tool in their arsenal, there's still that research that started way back when by Vernon Applegate and his team continues to this day.
Yeah, that was going to be one of my questions later on is, we feel like TFM is very safe. You can use it in pretty small quantities when we think about parts per million here. But, what is going on to maybe get something better to treat these, Mark?
We're looking at anything. So first of all, TFM, which is the lampricide that we talk about in the film that was discovered in 1957. We're looking at things like, have the lamprey developed a resistance to it? Because it has been used since 1957. We're not seeing much to be concerned about, but we're looking at that. But are there greener lampricides? This TFM is pretty safe. It photodegrades and it's non-detectable in the environment after about 12 hours. But are there better ways to do it? And that's what we're looking at in the lab. We continue to do so. Then there are other things like pheromones. Pheromones are odors that organisms give off to attract a mate, for example. So it's the smell of love or something. And we've discovered through research over the past several years, two pheromones especially that attract lamprey. One is a pheromone given off by a larvae that tells a migrating adult lamprey that's ready to spawn, hey, we're here in this stream. So this is obviously a good spawning stream. So it attracts the lamprey from the lake into a stream. That's a pheromone. And then another is a pheromone the male gives off that's ready to spawn up on a nest to attract the female to that individual male. And the lamprey, once it gets in a river, needs to know where the female lamprey is. So that's what that pheromone does. The lamprey is basically a swimming nose. Most of its brain is nose. And we found very minute quantities of these pheromones that will affect the behavior of lamprey. So we're investing research and development dollars into that. Of course, there's also new frontiers like genetics, which changes by the day, gets better and more improved on that one, that we're really just dipping our toe in the water on that. But those are some of the kinds of research that we're doing to find better ways to control lampreys. We're investing more dollars as well into understanding trapping. So can we remove more of these before they have a chance to spawn? Can we capture more of the out-migrating lamprey that are swimming from the river to the lake? That kind of stuff. So we always want to find better ways to do this for sure.
Yeah, I think it's another thing that you note in the film is that there is no cure to this. I mean, we're going to have this problem forever. We're going to have to deal with it. Talk about what happened during COVID, because I know we took a break with treating lampreys for that short time period. And what did you see as far as, was there any kind of surge when that happened? What happened over that little break that we took from treating the rivers?
Oh, there was a surge, all right. Yeah. So in 2020, we treated only about 25% of the streams that we had on the list. So it was about a 75% reduction. Part of it is travel was restricted. The border was closed. We're a border-blind binational control program. So we did lose quite a bit of lamprey control in 2020. 2021 was a much curtailed season as well. And then we were back in full force in 2022 and beyond. But in 2022, you saw the survivors of 2020 coming back to spawn. So here's a way to look at it. When we do a lampricide treatment in a stream, we kill about 98% of the larvae lamprey in that stream. The survivors of that treatment let's say in a normal treatment, 2%, will go out and kill fish for about 1.5 to 2 years and then come back to a stream to spawn. So the effect of your field season 2 years later when the survivors of that field season come back to spawn. So the 2020 season, which was about 75% less lamprey control, we saw a huge spike in lamprey wounds in 2022 and in returning spawners in 2022. So that told us, of course, that the curtailed season really did have a major effect on the lamprey numbers. And then 2023, which was the survivors of 2021, which again was a shortened season, came back in very, very large numbers. So in just the 2 to 3 year period, we saw significant increase in lamprey wounding. These fish were like Swiss cheese in some areas with the lamprey wounds. And we saw significant spikes in the lamprey numbers that we're just beginning to see now back on the downswing after several aggressive years of lampricide control. So these things will bounce back very quickly.
The good news is they have a life cycle similar to our Pacific salmon in that, it's about a 3 or 4 year life cycle. So once we get back on track, we can hopefully get back on track.
Yeah.
They're not out there forever.
But it was, we learned a lot from that COVID pause. It's a natural experiment, one that we never would have done, of course, voluntarily. But we did collect lots of information about what happens when you ease up control. And it's very important as not just a scientific tool, but a communications tool to the politicians that are very, very supportive. But it's always important to let them know why it's important to be doing this on an ongoing basis, because these lamprey, they'll spring back quickly given the chance. They're very opportunistic, and you're never going to get that last mating pair in the Great Lakes, so they're here to stay. The good news is we have a selective, effective way to keep them under control. I guess the bad news is that control is just going to be ongoing.
Yeah, one of the other points, I love that you brought up the political end of it. One of the other points in the film was, all of this was happening when there was a lot happening with our country in the 1930s, and there was a lot of political hand wringing and political hurdles that we had to get over, and working with Canada, and then you've got the First Nations, you've got the tribal community of the United States, you've got companies that you're working with. We talk about how the lakes are intertwined, but how we deal with these things and how we come up with solutions are really intertwined too. Lindsey, can you kind of talk a little bit about that and what it took to kind of get everybody on board with this?
Well, Marc is really the expert in terms of the government relations that happened with this. There was a lot of resistance early on by people in the United States who didn't want to have the federal government step in and get involved with this. A lot of the fishing industry people didn't want more regulation. They didn't want more government participation in this, but things just kept deteriorating to the point where they realized if they didn't have they didn't have the money to do whatever it was going to take to fight the sea lamprey. So they came to the government and said, "Look, you guys got to." Eventually, they just saw there was the handwriting was on the wall. They had no option but to get the governments involved, and that it had to be a binational effort. That they had to reach across the border to Canada, and both sides had to work on this, because if the effort just happened in the United States and it wasn't happening in Canada, then sea lamprey were just going to go over there and reproduce. So things got just so desperate and so bad, and so many small towns and small businesses were, the small town economies were going under. People, in the film, you'll see archival footage of boats just, that had been abandoned because people couldn't use them anymore. And so it was a dire situation, and it ended up forming this. It ended up being the impetus to create this binational organization, the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. So.
All right, guys, we're getting close to wrapping up. The film kind of wraps up with, hey, we found the solution. We were on the right track. And then all of a sudden we've got this new problem with alewife. And that's how we get our Pacific salmon in the lakes. Do you guys, one of you want to touch on that before we wrap up here?
Well, it's interesting because the impetus for lamprey control and the main political thrust, as we talked about, was commercial fishing. And commercial fishing, probably by around early to mid 1960s, was becoming to be eclipsed by the recreational fishery. So post-war, more leisure time, more disposable income, and a growing interest in people getting outdoors. So today, compared to say the 1930s, 40s, 50s, the recreational fishery is much larger comparative to the commercial fishery. But everything that was done to find a solution to the lamprey problem, even if it was motivated at the time by the commercial fishery, applied to the recreational fishery. And without the sea lamprey control program, there is no way that the states or the federal government or anybody could have promoted the recreational fishery the way that they did. And today, again, it is about a $5.1 billion fishery with lamprey control as the foundation for that.
Yeah, I'd like to say that, a lot of people don't realize, I grew up in the Great Lakes region fishing, and a lot of people don't realize that before the alewife the alewife invasion and before sea lamprey control, most recreational fishing was done on the inland lakes. People didn't go out on the big lakes because of to go out in boats and everything. The things to catch on the big lakes were walleye in certain parts of the lakes, but also lake trout was the main quarry for sport fishermen at the time. And I'm sure all your fishermen know usually you have to fish deep for them, and you have to do some trolling, and they're hard to catch. So this sea lamprey control made it possible to deal with the alewife's invasion. That created the opportunity to introduce salmon and deal with that alewife situation. But that could not have happened without sea lamprey control. No one would have put those salmon into the Great Lakes because the sea lamprey would have just eaten them like they do the lake trout and everything. So that salmon fishery that came in and that people are still enjoying today would never have happened without sea lamprey control. And it basically solved the alewife the problem. And lake trout are actually doing a lot better now than they have been in a long time. So I interviewed scientists who said basically the salmon experiment worked. That it is making the lakes a lot more hospitable to lake trout again, and lake trout recovery is doing much better now than it had in the past. So
that's excellent. The movie is The Fish Thief, and you can find it on Prime and Apple TV. And I watched it free of charge with my Prime membership. So you had to watch about, 2 minutes worth of commercials. But other than that, it was a really great watch. It was fun to see. Anywhere else, if people want to find the documentary, where can they find it?
I think it's on Google TV now, and it's on YouTube, I think, for pay YouTube, and there's other places where it's going to be showing up as well. And we're still doing screenings and film festivals as well. And we'd like to let people know if we are making the film available to support nonprofit organizations and organizations across the Great Lakes region and elsewhere to have in-person screenings, and sometimes we have panels of experts come, and myself and other people from the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. Sometimes we even have an aquaria full of live sea lamprey if people want to hold a sea lamprey. One of the big surprises for me is they've turned out to be oddly charismatic. People crowd around these tables to see sea lamprey and hold on to them. So any organizations out there that might be interested in this, we just like them to know that that's something that's a possibility. We're happy to support organizations and support screenings in that way. So.
If you want more information on sea lampreys and what the Great Lakes Fishery Commission is doing, you can go to their website, glfc.org. Gentlemen, any closing thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I'd just like to say, again, this film is for people who love to fish. This is for people who love the Great Lakes, but it's also for people who just like a good human story. This was a mystery that a lot of people worked hard on and were tenacious. It's a story about remarkable people tackling a problem and not accepting defeat. And so if you enjoy the Great Lakes and you enjoy tourism around the Great Lakes, that all the small towns where you have restaurants and motels and boat ramps and things like that. That's all happening now because of these people that tackled this problem and found a solution and have allowed these small towns that were on the verge of collapse to come back and have these vibrant economies again, tourism economies. So it's a story about how human tenacity and not giving up pay big economic benefits.
Mark, anything for you before we let you go?
No, just thank you very much for having us, and I hope folks enjoy the film. It was a lot of fun to make, and I hope it tells an interesting story.
Yeah, it was really good. I really appreciate you guys doing that and putting that together. I think it'll help a lot of people understand the water that they fish and the water that they recreate now and how it got to where it is. So much appreciated to you guys for spending some time with me, and hope everyone enjoyed the show. We'll talk to you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.